evening, everyone. My name is Patton, Executive Director of the Redwood Library. I want to welcome you this evening for a very special presentation by Stefanie Van Steelandt. And she is going to tell us about her new book that's just come out and won all sorts of prizes that I'll tell you about. Ms. Van Steelandt is an independent scholar and blogger who has spent the last 20 years studying biography, an important genre. The title of her book, Lady of the Army, The Life of Mrs. George S. Patton, tells the story of the general's greatest champion in life and fiercest defender. Lady of the Army straddles the line between the home and war fronts and tells the story of Beatrice Ayer Patton, the woman who shaped the man, fortified the soldier, and created the legend. Just that. The book itself has been called a triumph by Joan Holbrook Patton and hailed for its extensive research and factual reporting. And I should mention that Ms. Van Steelandt has spent 4 years researching the book, so it's packed full of good stuff. Here's Ross Rojek of the Manhattan Book Review. A unique book in the military biography field, Steelandt does a masterful job detailing the life of Beatrice Ayer Patton. It's an enjoyable, readable book about an important woman of the 20th century, as well as an academic book with extensive references and background for you scholars of history. So, without further ado, welcome, thank you, and here is Stefanie Van Steelandt.
And thank you for this great introduction. I wasn't sure what was going to happen, so this was lovely, especially because this is my first time talking about Lady of the Army. So it always reminds me of this. Can everyone hear? No. This is better?
Yeah.
Okay. Where was I? Oh. It reminds me of the letter that Beatrice wrote when her husband invaded, pretty much Operation Torch, when he invaded North Africa. And when she heard the good news that he had landed safely, she sent him a letter and she said, the first step is taken and you never have to take it again. So that's what it feels like for me tonight. I had planned, to start a certain way, but I spent the last few days up on Massachusetts North Shore, which is actually where the Ayer family comes from, Beatrice's family. So if you want to know the history of the Ayers, you just go up there for a weekend and you can travel around, starting in Lowell and Lawrence, which is where the head of the family, Frederick Ayer, started creating first a patent medicine business, which is with his brother. And that made him enough money to then invest in the textile business, which was very prominent in that area. And when he got married, twice actually, his first wife died. He had 4 children with his first wife, and then 3 more with his second wife. And the family, the mother, always compared her 7 children, even though they weren't all hers, to 7 birds sitting on a wire, because they just stuck together. If you saw one Ayer at a party, you saw all others just together. And the reason I tell this about the Ayers is that they were very supportive, both to Beatrice and later on to General Patton. So I'm going to call him George. I spent 4 years with him, researching him, and I feel like I probably know him quite well now. So no disrespect, it's just the fact that I know so much about him, I think that it's easier. So let me just show you this picture. This is Green Meadows. So it's a house that the Pattons bought in 1927. It was interwar years, and George was desperate for another war because World War I had ended. He liked war. He liked the history and the tactics of it. So he was desperate for another war to show and to reach his destiny, pretty much, to lead a big army in battle. And he knew it was going to happen at some point. He just didn't know when, but he wanted to be ready, and he wanted his wife to be surrounded by family who could help her in case something happened, which he expected. He didn't expect to come back the second time, so it would be nice for the family to be around. And you can actually visit Green Meadows these days, and it's a fun visit because it was a house. The Patton family lived in it until about 10 years ago, but it's also kind of a museum because George during World War II had a tendency to send home souvenirs, lots of them. There's a cannon in the back of the garden that his grandchildren would play on. There's German helmets on the wall. It's books, hundreds and hundreds of books that he read in preparation for going there. And Beatrice organized everything. So, like I said, the heirs are very important to the story of General Patton, even though many people don't realize that. And I already got this question earlier, how did I pick this topic? Because even to this day, when I tell people, oh, I wrote a book about Beatrice and Patton, they're like, oh, General Patton was married? Yes, he was. And he had 3 children. And I understand why people think that, because if you watch the movie, the 1970 movie, Patton with George C. Scott, no one mentions Beatrice or his private life at all. I think he mentions his wife once, and that's it. So that's the same thing that happened. I watched the movie. I was intrigued by this General Patton who wrote poetry and believed in reincarnation. So I read a biography, and I actually liked the story of his wife better than his story. So the little details that they had in there. And that's how I decided to write the book about Beatrice R. Patton, which was an actual joy because the Pattons kept everything. From his early childhood, his parents kept letters, drawings, his class books. Beatrice continued that because she, just like he, was convinced that one day he would reach his destiny and become this big general who would be remembered forever. So that's how it all started. And the biggest collection is actually at the Library of Congress. And when I went to research there in 2019 for the first time, I came upon the first letter that they wrote to each other. And that will tell you the story of how they met. So these are actually 3 families. They're the heirs, the Bannings, and the Pattons. I'm not going to go into detail, but Beatrice's mother was related to the Banning family. She was a Banning, and the Bannings were married with the Pattons in certain places. I mean, certain people were married. I'm not going to tell you who. You can read the book. It explains it much better than I can do here. But in 1902, it was the summer, Beatrice arrived in a private railroad car with her family in Los Angeles, and the Pattons were waiting, including 17-year-old George. You can see them here. I don't know who the other little girl is, a Banning family member, but George is on top and Beatrice is on the right. And George had been told that he would be meeting this amazing debutante from Boston, beautiful, and he was going to be in charge of chaperoning her pretty much, because they were going to go to Catalina Island, which was owned by the Banning family, so all related. And then he saw Beatrice get off the train. Her hair loose all the way up to her behind pretty much, carrying a big doll, which was almost as big as her because she was only about 5'2". And the doll was dressed in the same clothes that she was. So George was mortified. Because he had a reputation to uphold. I mean, this was something that he started from early childhood all the way till the day he died. He had an image that he wanted to portray. And people on Catalina Island knew him as this rough guy who went hunting goats and who was destined to be in the army. So the idea that he would have to take this little girl along just embarrassed him. And for days he tried to get rid of her. And he did the most crazy things that he could think of. You know, imagining that she wouldn't be interested in climbing a mountain to kill a goat, or to go swimming in the rough surf and, you know, with seals and things like that. But he was mistaken. It had the opposite effect. So Beatrice, the moment she saw George, she fell in love. And that happened often with him. People either loved him the moment they met him, or they hated him. And in her case, it was love at first sight and, you know, devotion for the rest of their lives together. So she tried to get rid of him. Yeah, it didn't work. She followed him everywhere like she would do for the rest of their lives together. The reason that Beatrice was already so strong and iron-willed was because of her childhood. She was born in 1886 so that's pretty much what they looked like at that point. So that's George on the left, and then Beatrice and her two younger siblings on the right, who were on vacation with them as well. So Beatrice was raised to be opinionated, independent, and self-assured. So here she is. So I think the picture on the left speaks volumes, the way she's already looking at the camera. So her parents were rich, which meant that she traveled. For the first 16 years of her life, she traveled to the places George only read about in history books. And then she went to Egypt, where she almost got a tattoo, because the captain of the boat they sailed on had one, and she actually took a toe from a mummy, because in those days, we're talking 1892, you know, there was no preservation or anything like that. So off she went with a toe of a mummy that she kept with her for the rest of her life. So all those experiences gave her a kind of self-assurance that George actually was lacking. You know, he looked very tough and secure, but he wasn't. Not at all. It was more of an image to, you know, so people would believe that he was actually going to be in war one day. Going too fast. So, once, you know, the vacation ended, Beatrice returned home, and George was kind of wondering what he, you know, felt something for this little girl, but he didn't know what, and it would take him about 8 years to figure it out, but he was confident on the parade ground, but not so much when it came to affairs of love. But Beatrice wasn't willing to give up, so she began writing letters the moment she came home. And the first one that, you know, the letter I mentioned in the fall of 1902, he wrote her back when she sent him a birthday gift. And the letter ended with, "For above all things, he," which was George, "desires an early and glorious death." So that's the first thing he writes, you know, Beatrice. And I think most people, most girls at that point would be like, okay, enough. But once again, it had the opposite effect. You know, he told her that he didn't care about a home life or friends. It didn't matter to him. He only had one, you know, goal in mind. And the thing is that most people probably would have laughed when they heard someone talk like that at that age. But Beatrice didn't. She was actually compelled to just decide to follow him and to help him reach his destiny, which is what he wanted. So no matter what happened down the line, you know, the effects on her health of the things that came to pass over the years, she never curbed his fighting spirit, because she knew that if you do that, it probably will have the opposite effect, especially on a man like George Patton. So it took him about 8 years of courtship, which wasn't so bad, because, you know, when George was at West Point, it was a Spartan life, and he enjoyed the good things in life. So whenever he had free time, he could visit the heirs up on the North Shore. He would go to Athenæum and Bryce Crossing during the summer to swim, ride horses. He actually, those steps up there, there's a story of the whole family just sitting there one day, and they saw this huge white horse come up the driveway, and he walked up the steps, George, and bent down, and that's how things were. And during winter, he went to the Tiffany Air Mansion in Boston, which was built by by Tiffany himself for the family, and it's to this day one of the last examples in the world of a home that was built by Tiffany, Louis Humphrey Tiffany himself. And it was in that home in the library that eventually in 1908, George told Beatrice, I love you. And she said, well, yeah, of course, I've known this. And I love you too, and I've known this since 1902, but it's fine. But surprisingly, they decided not to get married, or he decided not to ask for her hand in marriage yet, because he was about to graduate West Point, was about to be sent to the Philippines, or so he thought, and he didn't want to, just make her come with him, because she didn't know anything about military life, and her family didn't know anything about it. But in 1910, it did take place, the wedding. Near the on the left is George and Beatrice, and on the right is her father, Frederick, Beatrice. So Frederick here was actually 64 when his daughter was born. So in this picture, he's about, he's 88. So yeah, he's a remarkable man for his age. Way ahead of his time in many things that he did, including healthcare, in the sense that he ate only very little, he exercised a lot, he rode his horse every morning until he was 96, a few days before he died, and he actually worked until the day he died. So he wasn't that very different from Beatrice, and actually his son-in-law, because he believed in trying new things, almost like George eventually decided to go with the tank corps. This was actually one of the things that Frederick Hare suggested that he do when he was thinking of in World War I, setting up the U.S. tank corps. He asked his father-in-law by letter from France, and Frederick said, you should do it, anything you can do to minimize casualties, hopefully, you should just go for it. And so he did. It probably wasn't the only reason he did it, but it was a big enough reason that the letter his father-in-law wrote him, and vice versa, they kept it in their wallets for a very long time. So Beatrice is now an army wife, which is probably not something that she ever expected, but she adjusted quite well. And she was an immediate asset to her husband's career. She didn't only have the attributes the wife of a career officer needed, but she also corrected George's writings. His spelling was quite bad at certain points. She attended his lectures, sat in the back, taking notes on things he should improve. She practiced French with him because she was very accomplished in French after living there for 2 years as a child. And at one point, she even drove a tank for him. When he was trying to convince the higher command that tanks were necessary even after World War I ended, and they were the future. It didn't help at that point, but she did it. So, and as she said herself one day, there is no career except that of a minister's wife in which a woman can be more of a help or a detriment to her husband than that of an army wife. She lives practically at his place of business and sees his associates daily. And if she's a shirk or a gossip, she is known as such throughout the service. Her reputation begins at her first post and sticks to her as closely as her skin until she dies. And Beatrice indeed got a reputation. First, that she was quite tough. She had a temper, and she matched George pretty well in that, but he was actually afraid of her, he said sometimes, when they were still dating, or whatever they called it in those days, he told, he was desperate for a picture of her, and she was coy in sending one. So he carefully asked her one more time, saying, please don't don't do what you did last time, just send me the picture. But she was also a very kind person who always gave advice. And this didn't start that way. In the army, it's one big family and everyone helps each other. At first, Beatrice was a little taken aback by this because, in Boston, where she grew up on Commonwealth Avenue, people didn't knock on your door unannounced, especially now when it was the eldest lady of or pilot, I believe it was, who came to knock on her door in 1911, carefully asking her if she actually knew that she was pregnant. That she was 8 months pregnant with their first child at that time. There we go, here they are. And of course she knew she was pregnant. It was just her own choice. She didn't want to see the army post doctor, and she went out on her own. And she was of course offended at that point, because why would someone tell her something like that, of course. But then she came to realize that it was a job of a wife who was reared in the army to teach her what she knew to a wife recruited from civilian life. And, as time progressed, roles reversed, and, she no longer knocked on someone's door for help, they knocked on her door for help. And what happened was, she kept a notebook of all the advice that she would hand out. And one of the most important ones that I think, and which is the essence of Beatrice Patton, is interested people are interesting. That's pretty much the motto she lived by. And that was most obvious when the Pattons were sent to Hawaii. There we go. When Pattons were sent to Hawaii twice, first in 1925 and then again around that time in 1935. And there's a story of her, actually in 1927, the volcano erupted. Okay. Mount Athenæum erupted in 1927, and the independent Beatrice took the car on the road to the Big Island, drove up to the top, and stood on the edge of the crater. And her close friend Emma Taylor, who was a high priestess and Hawaiian royalty that she had befriended, had told her that you should throw ohila berries in the pit, because it's an offering to Pele and it'll bring good luck. Well, Beatrice did that, and all of a sudden one of the branches she threw in came back up and landed back up at her feet. If that happened or not, the Pattons were storytellers, so. But it's a good story. And Emma, she told the story to her friend Emma, and Emma said, when that happens, it means that, Pele is willing to share with you. And Pele wasn't the only one. Actually, all the native Hawaiians wanted to share with Beatrice. They shared stories that they didn't tell any other foreigners, because most of the time at that time they were ridiculed for the things they told. They invited her to special offerings and ceremonies, and she went all over the islands looking at whatever she could find, graves. At one point she hung from a rope and descended into a cave overhanging the ocean so she could take a look at the so-called giants that at one point lived on Hawaii. So that was the kind of person that Beatrice was. And this eventually led to her writing 2 books on Hawaiian legends. First a French one, which was mostly for the family, and then right here, the 2 books in the window there. In 1937, she wrote Blood of the Shark, which was a fiction book based on the the story of how Hawaii, how the Europeans pretty much arrived in Hawaii and how they changed the native culture. So this was actually at a time, and I'm jumping ahead now, so otherwise I'll be talking too long. But By this time, George, this is 1937, George was actually, Beatrice's star was rising and George's star was falling. He was in a deep depression because the war had been over for a long time. He was at an age where he was wondering if he was even going to make it to the next war. I mean, there was talk about war in Europe obviously at that point, but he was worried he would be too old to go over. So, Beatrice decided to do whatever she could to help him. That was at that point her goal in life, to get him through the humdrum of the interwar years. And it started probably in 1923, after she gave birth to their son, George Patton, at that point George Patton IV, who eventually became a major general himself. And once she gave birth to him, it was like she felt free to do whatever she wanted and be as daring as her husband. And she had always been an accomplished equestrian and an accomplished sailor. But being with George meant that she had to take it up a notch. So they participated in the hunt, for example. That was their favorite pastime. Just riding at top speed, George yelling back at Beatrice, who wants to live forever? Just jump over the highest jump, and it doesn't matter what's on the other side. And that's what the Pattons did. They always brought out the best in each other, always striving for perfection and helping on never failing one another. So I'm just, now it's 1937, and George is pretty depressed despite Beatrice's efforts, but she's tired of trying to pull him along without getting anything back from him. They sailed back from Hawaii on their schooner, the Autor. It takes them 6 weeks. They almost die on the way, but for George that meant, God saved me. So there's something else in store for me, and Beatrice just went along. That's until one day it was just enough, and his behavior became too much. And just at the point when his star was starting to rise again, and he was sent to Fort Benning to train the take command of the 2nd Armored Division and the 2nd Armored Brigade at that point, she decides not to follow him anymore. And he goes off by himself, and he's desperate for her because it was obvious at that point that he withered without Beatrice's adoration and approval, and he needed her help. And the first few weeks that he was there, he didn't do so well. He begged her to come back, and she did, and that's when things turned around. It was the war that brought them back together. She wasn't going to leave him at this point after spending all that time together. So she was there when he prepared for World War II. She's on the left in Fort Benning, and then on the right when he was sent to India to the desert to start the desert training center. She followed him. And you can see her sitting in the back there.
Sorry.
That's okay. So after that, things actually happened really fast, and by the summer of '42, he was in Washington to begin planning Operation Torch, and in November 1942, he was off. And it happened 3 times that Beatrice saw her husband off to war. First, the Mexican punitive expedition, World War I, and World War II. The first 2 times were pretty hard for Beatrice, and she pretty much permanently damaged her health in the worrying that she did. And it gave her, caused a type of heart disease that both her mother and her daughter were susceptible to as well. But by the 3rd time, she was kind of used to it, and she realized that there's no point in worrying. It's best to keep busy, and that's what she did. The War Department asked her to become a spokesperson. She traveled all across the country, speaking, selling war bonds, things like that. And then, of course, she kept up her epistolary relationship with her husband, trying to bolster his morale whenever he was down during, whatever, the slapping incident, all the things that happened that he got embroiled in. And they kept in touch before the days of email and things like that by letter. He wrote her every day, pretty much. even during, except maybe during the Battle of the Bulge, when it was very busy, but other than that, every day he wrote her. She wrote him back pretty much the same thing, and she followed him on his map. You can see her on the left, and she had been schooled by him so well, in military history that there's a map, and she pretty much accurately predicted where the Third Army was going to take off, because she didn't know anything. She didn't know more than anyone else. So that's what happened when you're married to someone like George Patton. So I want to leave some time for questions. So this is, June 7, 1945. It was about 3 years after George had left for war and he came back. It was in Boston, a victory parade followed by a war bond selling tour. And after that, he spent a few days with his family. And Beatrice had actually kind of accepted the fact that he would die in war and that she would never see him again. So it was actually quite a big surprise that they were able to meet up again. But not so much for George. At the end of his month-long stay, he sat down with his daughters to say goodbye, and he told them, this is goodbye forever. I'm never going to see you again. I'll see your mother again, but you won't be seeing me again. And he was right. 6 months, well, not even 6 months later, Beatrice got a phone call that he had been involved in a car accident, and she, as always, went to his bedside. She had 2 harrowing days trying to get there. Planes had almost crashed, and they were over the Atlantic Ocean looking for another downed plane to see if there were any survivors. So the story itself of how she got to Heidelberg eventually is a movie on its own. But she did, and she spent the next 10 days with him, reading to him as she had always done, until he passed away on December 21st. She was the only family member there, together with her brother Fred. He's the one on the right. He had always been one of the closest relatives, both to Beatrice and to George. It was his best friend. So, whatever reason he had to ask his brother-in-law to come, is something that only they know. But there he was. So at this point, Beatrice had expected for her husband to come home and retire. So she's left on her own, and she takes it upon himself to finish the work that he had been planning to do himself. So she finished his autobiography, which he had started writing probably in mid-1945, and published it despite a lot of people who were opposed to it and advised her not to. But Beatrice had his fervent belief that her husband couldn't do much wrong in her eyes, and her most cherished memory was his legacy. So she was going to do everything possible to protect it, which meant publishing the book, taking care of all his papers. It took a few years for her and her brother-in-law to go through everything, but they did biographers a great service. They transcribed it, they annotated it. I was able to read everything, which was very helpful. And she traveled across the world, naming ceremonies. On the right-hand side, she's with her son, George Patton IV, at West Point when the statue was inaugurated in 1952. She also spent a lot of time on the boat that she had built for George when he suffered a horseback riding accident, and which left his career in doubt. And then lastly, she continued to hunt until September 29, 1953, when the heart trouble that she had been having for a long time finally caught up with her. And during the hunt, going over its jump, she died. And it was kind of ironic, because it was exactly the way that George had wanted to die. This was like the battlefield for her. And she died with her boots on, and it was a fitting end in that regard. So I'm just gonna end with one of my favorite things that Beatrice ever said, because she spent her life in devotion to her husband, but I don't think that takes away from the fact that she was her own woman, and she did contribute. For me, her contribution to World War II pretty much, and that was that she enabled George to be the man he had to be and wanted to be, so that he could reach what he called his destiny. And when she was asked one day if army wives aren't just the tail of a kite, she said, "How high can a kite soar without its tail?" And I think that was the story. Okay, does anyone have questions? Yes.
When he came after the victory parade in Boston,
Mm-hmm.
and then all of a sudden he was in Heidelberg in a car accident.
Mm-hmm.
So what brought him back over to Germany after the war?
Oh, okay. So the question was, what brought George back to Europe after his victory parade? So he was sent back to become governor of Bavaria, which was a decision that, and this is a part I skipped, but I can go into it now. This was a decision made by General Eisenhower, which was probably not the best decision, because Patton was not a diplomat. I mean, he did a decent job in North Africa, but other than that, I think the Eisenhowers and the Pattons had known each other since 1920 at Camp Meade. By that point, it should have been obvious that that was probably not the best thing to do. And even though he did a decent job and his area was, getting better quite fast, I mean, because of the help of some Nazis that were still in power, so that was the issue, which eventually caused him in September of 45 to be taken away from the Third Army and no longer being part of, governing Bavaria. And he was sent to command the 15th Army, which was a paper army in charge of writing the history of the war. And that broke his spirit. And Beatrice knew that. And from that point forward, she was a very good hater, a very good one. And she never, I forgave the press, because they had, were present at the conference, which pretty much caused his downfall. I mean, that's too long to go into, but that's the gist of it. And she never forgave General Eisenhower, to the point that in 1952, her daughter, Little B, which was the eldest, she passed away from heart disease as well. And Mamie Eisenhower called to offer her condolences, and it was Joanne Patton, Beatrice's daughter-in-law, who answered the phone. And she called over her mother-in-law, to hand her the phone, and she refused to take it. So that's pretty much how deep it went for her.
Thank you for this. Pretty fascinating. What was her public profile in the United States during the war while her husband was on the front? Both working, I guess, with other war bonds or whatever, and also did she have to manage the media of that time with all the news, mostly good but not always good, about George Patton?
Well, yes, she was a reluctant public person. She was rather shy in a certain way, although it doesn't sound like she was when you read some of the stories. But she would do anything, if the press wanted to talk to her, she would, especially if it helped her husband. Most of the time, however, they showed up when there was another scandal. What she did during those times was she gave one statement, a polite statement, and that was it. And she just didn't speak to the press anymore. And it obviously happened quite a few times. And there's a ton of letters that George writes her, apologizing for, "I'm sorry I got you into trouble again, because this happened or that happened. I didn't mean to, but thank you for, defending me." And that's what she would do. She would give a polite answer. She would stop her public appearances for a while if something like that happened, and then she would take them up again. But it seems like at that point is when the press started to become quite comical, and there was a certain point where a journalist was asking for a photograph of General Patton in his bathing suit, because it was in February 45, I think, and he had been told that he had swum across a river to show his soldiers what to do. And it obviously that didn't happen, but they called her up in the middle of the night, and the journalist said, "I'm on my way, Mrs. Patton. I just want to see a picture of your husband in his bathing suit." And she hung up, he called back, and she's like, "Okay, if he did what you said he did, why do you think he even wore a bathing suit?" So that's how she dealt with the press. I hope that answered it. I'll go with you next. Lady Bagger was first.
Considering that she came from a life of privilege
Mm-hmm.
and money, was there much, written about the reaction of her parents when she first met him and fell in love, in terms of being enamored that she would be involved with an army person, or was that not seen as?
No, I like to always say that it was especially Frederick Eyre who would want to protect his daughter, but I always say that Frederick Eyre loved George. He didn't love Soldier George. And he accepted him right away, and he was invited, into the house from the moment they met. And it was only until Frederick started noticing, the intentions, that he said he tried not to stop the relationship from happening, but he tried to change George's mind. And he said, I have this big company, the American Woolen Company, which made textile for World War I, World War II, and things like that. And what Frederick, who usually got what he wanted, he was a very humble and kind person, but he was a good businessman. He didn't realize how stubborn George was when it came to this, and eventually he said, if this is what you want to do, then I'll support you from now on. I will make the money, and you will make the glory for the family. And that's what they did. Yeah.
After he left Sicily and went to England, and before the Normandy invasion, did Beatrice go there and live with him in England?
No. She probably she would have wanted to, because there was no one as desperate to be with her husband, even at war, than Beatrice. And this started in World War I, actually. The first few months that he was in France during World War I, she tried everything to get a passport to be with him in Paris and spend, the war there. It almost happened until she realized that it might hurt George's chances of doing what he wanted to do, so she stayed behind. And by World War II, she had learned that there was no point in doing that. So she never, at that point, tried to go, and she never went to England during World War II. I know George tried a few times to go back home for a little bit, but that just never worked out. So they didn't see each other from November 42 until June 45.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have any questions? Yeah.
I actually have been to the cemetery where he's buried in Luxembourg because my uncle is buried there. Where is she buried?
Oh, that's a good question. There's quite a family story to that. So Beatrice it was her choice to bury him in Germany, in Luxembourg, because that's what he wanted. And she wanted to be there too. And before she passed away, she tried for several years to get permission to do so, even going up as high as General Eisenhower and things like that. But she never officially got permission to do so. So when she passed away, she was cremated. And there in the backyard of the home that I showed earlier, Green Meadows, there's a big rock and a plaque with her name on it. And supposedly she's buried there. But a few years after she passed, her daughter Ruth Helen and her son George IV and a few other family members took some of her ashes, or all, I don't know, to Luxembourg, and they were reunited there, which is, that's the story. No one is going to confirm it or deny it because it's probably not supposed to happen, but I think we can be sure that she's in Luxembourg at somewhere. Thank you. There's 5 million stories I could read. Oh,
I have one more question.
sure.
So you said he wrote a letter every day and they were separated for 3 years. So that's over 900 letters you had to go through?
Yeah.
Now, how did you do that? That's what I want to know.
Well, they're actually very interesting to read. He was a very good letter writer. And let me just say that it's mostly his letters that were kept. Her letters, I don't know what he did with them, or I'm sure they got lost somewhere. There's only 10% of the letters are hers and 90% are his. But they are a joy to read. There's Martin Blumenson, who actually has 2 big volumes on that, and they're interesting, but he took out all the personal stuff, which is what I focus on. So it was very interesting to read. It's a joy and a lot of fun. So if you get a chance.
How easy is it to read them?
Well, it would be terrible if Beatrice hadn't done the work of transcribing them after his death.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So it's all typed in.
It's all typed.
in the computer, and you could go through a computer.
No, you have to, the originals, you still have to do the originals, so
Okay.
they're not digitized yet, but, and you can compare them, so because sometimes she didn't accurate, or she left a few things out, but that was beyond the scope of what I was doing. I didn't need to know every little detail.
So are they planning to digitize it? Just curiosity.
Probably, about 20% is digitized. You can read his diaries are digitized, and his hunting diaries from the 1930s.
Wow.
Mhm.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. If anyone's interested in reading more stories about Beatrice, the book is for sale, and I'll be signing them on your way out.